Welcome to another episode of Living Justice, Living Leadership. I'm your host, Lee Fisher, Dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University. You know, I've had the great privilege to live my life at the intersection of the public, private, nonprofit, and academic worlds. As a lawyer, CEO of 2 nonprofit organizations, and as a state legislator, attorney general, and lieutenant governor. And the lessons I've learned come down to just 2 words: justice and leadership. That's why every week we'll talk to people who are walking the walk. Some are lawyers and some are not, but all of them have something in common. They are change makers. They are guardians of justice. They are living justice, and they are living leadership. Today, my guest is the 68th governor of the state of Ohio, Ted Strickland. Today, you're going to learn a lot about Ted Strickland, not just as a governor, not just as a politician, but as a human being. Did you know that he was an ordained minister? Did you know that he got his PhD in psychology? Did you know that he was born and raised in poverty? You'll hear about that and so much more in the first half of this podcast. The next podcast, podcast number 2, will be the other part of Ted Strickland, where we talk about his political career, his time with President Bill Clinton, and his thoughts about what has happened in the last few years under President Trump and what happened on January 6th, what is known as the insurrection against the Capitol. So stay tuned. This is part 1. Next week will be part 2 of the 68th governor, Ted Strickland. Well, welcome to the Living Justice, Living Leadership podcast. I could not be more excited that my guest today is the 68th governor of Ohio, Ted Strickland. And for those of you who don't know who's speaking right now, I'm the host. I'm Lee Fisher, and I'm the Dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University. The reason today's episode is so special for me is that this particular guest is not only a longtime friend, but he fundamentally changed my life. When he called me back in January of 2006, I was the president of a nonprofit organization in Cleveland called the Center for Families and Children, wondering whether I ever might return to the public arena. And he gave me that opportunity when he said, "Lee, I've asked 7 people to be the lieutenant governor. They all turned me down. Would you be the lieutenant governor running mate?" And I said, absolutely. And the rest is history. We won that election, and Ted then gave me the opportunity not only to be his lieutenant governor, but director of development for the state of Ohio. And I can't tell you what a wonderful experience was to be his partner. And I personally believe he's the best governor Ohio's ever had, and it'll be very hard to top him. Now, am I objective? Not in the least. But the bottom line is that I really do believe he was a great governor, but more importantly, he's a great human being. Ted was born on a little place called Duck Run, and he'll talk about that today because I'll be asking him. He's the one of 9 children. He was the first of his family to go to college. He's got 2 master's degrees and a PhD, a master's in guidance counseling and a master's in divinity and a PhD in psychology. He served for, I think it's 12 years in the U.S. Congress, 2 different stints, and we'll talk about that. And of course, most importantly to me, and I think to Ohioans, he served from 2007 to 2011 as Ohio's 68th governor. So that's a long introduction. Welcome, Ted Strickland.
Lee, I am so happy to see you and to be with you today.
Great. And by the way, you have a very impressive Zoom background. I like that. Who is that bust behind you? For those people who don't see or listening on audio, you won't be able to see this. But if you're watching visually, you'll see that Ted has a nice Zoom background.
Well, it's supposed to be the head of David, as sculptured by Michelangelo, I believe.
Okay. Well, I always knew you were a governor of culture, so I'm not surprised. Okay. Ted, I'd like to begin with your unique biography. Because even though you're known to Ohioans as the 68th governor, not everybody knows your remarkable, humble background in a place called Duck Run. So just share with us how life started for Ted Strickland and his family.
Well, Lee, it's wonderful to be with you and your listeners and viewers, and thank you for having me. I will be having a birthday in August, on August the 4th, the same birthday as Barack Obama, but he's 20 years younger than I am. I will be 80 years old. And 80 years ago, I was born in Duck Run, as you say. I was the next to the youngest of 9 kids. My father was a steel worker. My mother obviously had a lot of kids to take care of. We lived out in the country. I remember a life when we didn't have indoor plumbing. In fact, we didn't get indoor plumbing in my home until I was in high school. My parents went through a lot of hardship. They lost a home well before I was born when they lived in Portsmouth, Ohio, and the floods came in and just destroyed everything they had. They never were able to go back to that home. They moved out in the country and bought a home, and then hard times fell upon them, and they lost that home to the bank. But by the time I was born, things were a little better, and we were living in a home that I remember as a big farmhouse. I'm sure it was a quite small house, but when you're little, things look really big.
Exactly, I know, that's true.
And when I was about 5 years old, I remember being carried out of the house in the middle of the night by one of my sisters. And we stood on the side of the road with my mother. My father was at work. He was working midnight shift at the steel mill. And we stood on the side of the road and watched that house and all of our possessions burn to the ground. And so what did we do? My parents didn't have insurance, and they had a lot of kids to take care of. And so we did have a chicken house, a chicken shack. So my dad and my older brothers and sisters used cardboard for wallboard. And anyway, we ended up sleeping in the chicken house. I had whooping cough in that chicken house.
Oh my God.
And down over the hill, we had what was called a smokehouse. It was a cellar with a little house, a little building on top of it. And that's where Mom, made a kitchen where we ate. But, those were tough times, but, they were times, Lee, that I think shape you. I think as we go through life, all of our experiences, good and bad, shape us in certain ways. And so I learned a lot, obviously, when I was a young kid from my parents, because they worked really hard and they cared about us. And they did what they could to make sure that we were fed and clothed, and so in a lot of ways, I am grateful for those early beginnings because I think they, even today, Lee, I go walking in the park. I try to do it each day. Columbus has these beautiful metro parks.
Yes.
And I'll get out and just walk in the park, and I think. And I think a lot, and I reminisce a lot, and I think about the early experiences that I had, and some of them were tough, but in a way, I'm grateful for all of those experiences.
Ted, one of the things we talk about on this podcast is leadership, and I've always believed that two of the indispensable parts of leadership are humility and empathy, and I think that you get both of those attributes from where you were born and how you were raised. And I think that is indispensable. When people wonder, where do these things happen? It happens, by, as you said, by their life experiences. You're shaped by it. And I can honestly say that you probably are the most humble and empathetic public official I ever worked with. And I think it comes from Duck Run.
Well, if I can just share a recent experience, a young man who worked for me in my congressional campaigns and after I became governor, Greg Landsman. I think you may know Greg.
I do know Greg, yes.
Greg has gone on to make me very proud. He's now a council member in Cincinnati and has a wonderful family, wife and children. And I'm just really proud of him. And Greg did something as a member of council recently that was written about in a Cincinnati Enquirer editorial. Greg made a mistake, and he did something that was injurious to a fellow council member. And last week, he made a public apology to that individual. And the Cincinnati Enquirer wrote an editorial basically saying, Greg Landsman did something that is very rare. He apologized. He was a public official, and he apologized not only privately, but publicly. And so I sent Greg an email saying, Greg, I'm always proud of you, but now I'm especially proud of you.
That's fantastic.
And he sent back an email that just said, you taught me well.
Wow.
And it was like, it was such a wonderful gift that he gave me with that response.
That's something you should frame. I agree. That is wonderful. Ted, one of the things we also talk about on this podcast is that some of the people who've been most successful in their lives have failed and have lost. And you and I both are in that category. We've lost our fair share of elections. So you ran for Congress, as I recall, at least 3 times before you were successful, and then lost your reelection and then came back and served another 10 years. That's remarkable. Most people would have given up after the first or second try. Everybody I know except for Ted Strickland would have given up after the third try. But you kept going. Talk about that and what it was like to lose and, more importantly, to come back.
Well, sometimes younger people come and ask me advice about how they could get into political office and what a political career is like. And I usually tell them, I'm not going to advise you to follow my particular path. But the fact is that I did, as a young person, I was interested in serving in the Congress. I had never been in an elected office. And I ran for Congress 3 times, in 76 and lost, 78 and lost, and 80 and lost. And at the end of that third campaign, I sent a friend a note that said, it has been said that if at first you don't succeed, you should try and try again and then give up. There's no damn fool about it. and so 10 years passed, and I went ahead and finished my PhD, became a licensed psychologist, came to Columbus and practiced psychology, working in a large psychiatric hospital, and then started consulting so many hours per week at the prison in Lucasville. And then after 10 years, I decided to try it again. And lo and behold, I won that effort with 51% of the vote. And I went to Washington and I worked really hard, and I tried to do everything that was good and just and honest and so on. And when I stood for re-election, I lost with 49% of the vote. And so I immediately decided, within a week or so of that defeat, that I was going to do it again. So I ran again and I won with 51% of the vote. There were 3 elections that I had that were decided basically 51 to 49. And I won 2 of them and lost 1 of them. And then I solidified my standing with my district, and was able to hold on. And then after the 2002 census, I was given basically a new district, almost a new district. And I happened to win it. And then, the last time I ran for Congress, I didn't even have an opponent. It was wonderful.
That's a complete turnaround.
Yeah. But, Lee, I was, life unfolds. And you never know what's around the corner. You never know from one day to the next who you might meet, what experience you might have that can alter your life in a significant way. And I was in my office one day as a congressman, and I got a call from Senator Harry Reid, who is the majority leader in the Senate. And he said, Congressman, would you come over to my office? I'd like to talk with you. So I said, sure. So I didn't know Senator Reid, but a congressman being invited over to the Senate, that's a big deal. Those they think they're special.
Oh, yes, that's true.
I say even the security staff are different over on the Senate side than on the House side. But so I went over, and when I got over there, Senator Reed had Senator Schumer, Senator Stabenow, and Senator Durbin in his office. And he said, "We called you over here because we've been looking at your background, and we think you ought to run for the Senate." And I said, "Senator Reed, I hadn't really thought about running for the Senate. And would you do a poll to see if that would be, even considered reasonable to do?" So he did a poll, and it looked fairly encouraging. But my chief of staff at the time, Lee, was a guy that John Hazley.
Yep.
And John had worked on the Senate side with Senator John Glenn for a number of years before he worked for me in the Congress. And so John said to me, "Well, Ted, if you're willing to take a chance on leaving the House after you've worked half your life trying to get there, why don't you run for governor?" He said, "A governor can do more than a senator in terms of if affecting the lives of people in Ohio." And lo and behold, I decided to run for governor, and I had the good wisdom, Lee, to recognize your talent and to ask you to join me in that effort, which you did. And you served, as you said earlier, as the Director of Development for the state of Ohio during that great recession, during that most difficult time.
Yeah.
And Lee, you were magnificent. I tell people that there are people in Ohio today who have jobs, who are earning a living, who are caring for their families because of the work that you did as Ohio's Director of Development. And you always made me proud, man. You would come into my office and you would say, this company in such and such a place is having a problem and we got to take care of it. And you would go there and you would problem solve and make deals and offer suggestions. And you were a magnificent Director of Development. You really were. And it sounds like I'm pandering to you, but I have the greatest respect for what you did.
Well, that's very kind of you, and I hope our listeners don't think I invited you on the show just so you could say these nice things about me. But I appreciate it.
Well, if they wanted to call me personally, I could give them some of the other information. But
luckily, we're going to cut that short before you start getting to that. I don't want to hear that. I want to, before we go back into politics for a second, you also are a religious person. You have a master's in divinity. You're an ordained minister, which I didn't even mention in your remarkable bio. How has that shaped your private and public career?
Yeah. Well, Lee, I went to theological seminary for 3 years. It takes 3 years to get a Master of Divinity, as a matter of fact. And I served in a church for 1 year after finishing my divinity degree and becoming ordained, United Methodist. And that was in Portsmouth, Ohio. And while I was there, the bishop from Kentucky, an older man, Bishop Short, contacted me and asked me if I would consider returning to Kentucky to work in a children's institution that was owned by the Methodist Church and a place that I had volunteered work while I was a student. And so I did that. I went back there and I ended up spending a number of years at that institution. In fact, Lee, some of my closest friends today are young people who grew up in that institution. In fact, my very best friend grew up there, became a pediatric surgeon. And sadly, I just lost him a few months ago.
Oh, I didn't know that. I'm sorry to
a heart
that.
attack. He was my dearest friend.
I met him many times through you. Wonderful man.
Yeah, and his children are now like my grandchildren, right?
Yes.
So I was at the children's home, and I don't know. It was almost like an irrational decision, but that I just decided that I was going to return to Ohio and run for Congress. And I think it was because we were experiencing in this country a lot of upheaval and conflict. The Vietnam War was raging. The civil rights movement was in full swing. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was having such a huge influence. And then the Watergate episode came along. And I just got interested in politics and in public service. So I came back to Ohio. I had not yet finished my PhD. Came back to Ohio, no money. I didn't know anyone. I literally did not know. Lee, you are the dean of a law school, and I want to tell you something. I did not even know the boundaries of the congressional district. I didn't know which counties were in that district. I didn't know how you became a candidate, but I had read that you had to fill out a petition and signatures, right? So I went to an attorney in Kentucky. The guy probably should have been disbarred for doing this. And I told him I wanted him to prepare a petition for me that I could circulate, not knowing that I could just go to the local
Board of Elections. Exactly right.
And he charged me about $130 or so to create a petition that I could use. Not an official petition. That's how naive I was about running for political office. But I made a lot of friends. I love the experience, and I lost. I did a lot better than a lot of people thought I would, but I lost. Long story short, I ran again, 78, I lost. And then in 1979, I was leaving my apartment in Lexington, Kentucky to go defend my doctoral dissertation. And as I was getting ready to leave the apartment, the phone rang, and it was a reporter from the Dayton Daily News. And she said, Congressman Harsha has just announced that he's retiring. That's the man I ran against, right?
Yes.
And she said, what's this mean for you? And I said, I don't know, but it's coming at a good time. I'm going to get this PhD off my back. And so I decided to run a third time. And I did pretty well. I won half the counties, but I lost the election.
That was against Bob McEwen, right?
That was against Bob McEwen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I came to Columbus. After you get your PhD, in order to practice psychology, well, you've got to have a year of pre-doc internship, and then you've got to have a year of post-doc internship before you can apply to take the exam. So I came to Columbus, went to work for community mental health, and worked in a large psychiatric hospital. Took the exam, became a licensed psychologist, and practiced psychology in Ohio. And one of the things I did that we can talk about perhaps is probate pre-screening, but because it's very relevant to what's happening today, I think, in our community with mentally ill people being confronted with law enforcement. But anyway, after 10 years, I decided I'm going to try this again. So then I ran and I won, and then I lost, and then I won again, and then I served there, and then I became governor. So that's the story of my life.
That's quite a story, although that's still not the entire story of your life. You got a lot more than that to share. Before we go back to politics, which of course is my favorite subject, I want to stay on this for a second. Let's talk about the probate pre-screening, because during the discussions, particularly post George Floyd on May 25th, police reform and police accountability has been a subject that everyone's talking about. And one of the issues that people talk about is a lot are whether police are equipped to deal with those who are mentally ill and have serious issues. Should the police actually be dealing with them? And if they should be, how should they be trained? Give us your thoughts on probate pre-screening and your thoughts on that issue.
Well, I'm not sure how it's done in communities across Ohio now, but when I was working in mental health here in Columbus, Ohio, whenever anyone would contact probate court or the mental health system and say that they were aware of someone who was exhibiting signs of serious mental illness and may be dangerous to themselves or other people, well, what to do? You just can't go out and deprive someone of their individual liberty because of some opinion that somebody may have. So in those days, I was the person here in Franklin County that would go out to evaluate that person, to see if they did appear to meet the criteria for involuntary hospitalization. Because, involuntary hospitalization, I think, is the only time in our society when an individual citizen can be deprived of their individual liberty without having committed some kind of offense. And so I found myself in many different situations. I would go to donut shops to evaluate people or meet people in alleys or go to their apartments or the Greyhound bus station, wherever, and attempt to interview that person. And if it seemed that they met the criteria, I would go to probate court, sign the document. Then the police would go out and take that person into custody and bring them into the mental health system for a second evaluation by a psychiatrist. And if they met the criteria, then they would be placed in a hospital for their own protection and for the community's protection. And, I found myself dealing with some very difficult and very dangerous circumstances. And I won't go into all of those, but I'm concerned that that for a lot of reasons, a lot of people are ending up injured and in some cases killed under the hands of law enforcement unnecessarily. And so I've been engaged with another individual in looking at this problem in Ohio, and especially deaths that result from police interventions. And what we have found, surprisingly, is the problem seems to be more severe in Franklin County than in Cuyahoga County or Hamilton County, adjusted for population. And it's we're working on a research document that we hope to have published, but we also found that in Ohio, African-American deaths per 1 million population were 339% higher than white fatalities. So the question that I had is, why would there be fewer of these fatalities over the last 6 years? And that was the period we looked at.
Right.
Cuyahoga County and in Hamilton County compared to Franklin County. And I don't have an answer to that, but I do know that for several years, Cuyahoga County has operated under a federal consent decree.
That's true.
And in Hamilton County for a number of years, they have been working under an agreed upon arrangement with law enforcement there that caused very significant changes in how officers were trained and the culture and so on and so forth. That has not been the case in Franklin County. And just this statistic, Franklin County, looking at the 100 most populous counties in America, Franklin County ranks 18th in terms of police intervention fatalities per 1 million population.
That's startling.
But think of this, Cuyahoga County ranks 56th and Hamilton County ranks 61st. The amazing difference between being ranked 18th and 56th.
Absolutely.
And so I think this raises real questions that need to be examined and looked at.
I agree. And I think a lot of it, not all of it, comes down to training. and having a strong partnership between the mental health agencies and the ADAM boards and law enforcement. It is a real problem, and I'm glad you've focused on it. You've just listened to part one of a two-part podcast with the 68th Governor of Ohio, Ted Strickland. We learned a lot today about Ted Strickland, but there's so much more to learn. That's why my total interview with Ted Strickland actually lasted for more than an hour. We didn't want to try your patience, so we decided to make this into two podcasts, not one. So next week, we'll hear the second half of my interview with Governor Ted Strickland, his time with President Bill Clinton, his thoughts on the Trump presidency, and his thoughts about the future under President Biden. Stay tuned for next week.